Good evening and welcome. I'm Goblin and I hope this broadcast finds you well. Perhaps you are out walking under the stars, or driving home, or to some other destination, with the night air softly streaming in through the windows. Perhaps you are cooking, or cleaning, or lying in bed, preparing to slip off into dreams. Whatever it may be, I hope you are comfortable. I must say, I quite enjoy UFO stories. Sightings, close encounters, even abductions. However, I'm not all that knowledgeable about ufology, but I do find personal accounts to be fascinating. So, tonight, I've pored over old UFO newsletters and have gathered some interesting personal accounts that I'm going to read for you tonight. I don't have much to add to these stories, so please just relax and enjoy these strange encounters. The stories you will be hearing tonight all come from the Northern UFO News, which is a British publication edited by Jenny Randalls. These newsletters include editorials, current affairs on ufology, and reported sightings from eyewitnesses. All of the journals I read from for this broadcast are from the 1970s. So, if you're ready, get comfortable, and let's get started. March 17, 1978, Risley, Cheshire. Surface engineer Ken Edwards at 11:30 p.m. on Friday, March 17th, was driving home along a lonely road near the University Atomic Reactor. He picked up a strange figure in his headlight glare. He stopped the van and watched as it walked across in front of him, climbing down an embankment, stopping to look at him for several minutes, and then climbing up an embankment and walking through a fence 10 feet high with barbed wire on top. The figure was 7 feet tall in a silvery suit and had flexible limbs. It walked stiffly and had 2 beams of light from its eyes. Mr. W is an 85-year-old man who recalls a remarkable encounter that occurred in summer 1901. It took place at Burnburg, West Midlands, on a warm, sunny evening about 8 p.m. Mr. W was just a young boy at the time, returning home to his terraced house. In the garden, he saw a peculiar structure, 5 feet long, 4 feet high, and 3 feet wide, looking like a box with a turret on it and colored greeny blue. In the front was a door which opened outwards. 2 small men of humanoid appearance walked out. They wore tight-fitting gray uniforms with helmets on. Out of the top stuck 2 wires like antennae. One man stayed by the door. The other came in the direction of the witness, arms outstretched, seemingly warning him to get back. He then went back inside the UFO, which took off with a sudden flash, a terrific noise, and a red flame behind it. It zoomed into the sky in an arc, seen possibly by 2 other boys. Mr. W is certain this was not a childish dream, although some details are obviously unconsciously added due to the great passage of time. Lynn is a 32-year-old housewife who remembers vividly a day when she was playing ball with a friend in summer 1954. At the time, she lived in a terrace house in Hull, North Humberside. Glancing up, she observed a silver aircraft with no wing, tail, plane, or markings. Along its side was a row of portholes or windows, and looking out of these were 2 figures. Both appeared human-like, and one was a woman, the other a man, aged about 19 or 20, with light-colored hair. The woman half smiled at her, as if to say, "Yes, you really are seeing this." The object was almost on top of the roof and was stationary and totally silent. The young boy who was with her saw this all as well. She glanced away for a moment, and then looked back to find that the whole scene had just vanished without a trace. She told nobody about her encounter. Buforg related an intriguing tale of Mr. and Mrs. B from Coldstream, Roxburgh. Mrs. B has quite a psychic background, including seeing a dead aunt looking at her from the foot of her bed. Throughout winter 76 through 77, they had seen several lights in the sky and reported them to the local Royal Air Force, who proffered no explanation. Then, In early February 1977, late one clear evening, the two witnesses were driving on the Linnell Road, half a mile from Coldstream. Rounding a bend on the road ahead, they saw an oblong box about 6 to 7 feet wide and longer, but lower than a car, spanning the middle of the road. It glowed brilliant white and was surrounded by square windows, including the roof, traveling about 6 feet above the road. After about 50 seconds, it vanished. They stopped at the spot and found no trace of the object or how it could have disappeared. The husband sadly died on September 4th, and on November 29th, Mrs. B was driving with her daughter near Coldstream on a different road, again on a dark evening. A 7-foot-tall, dark, hooded figure leapt out of some bushes directly in front of the car. Seeing the figure in the headlight beams, the daughter, who was driving, slammed on the brakes, but again the figure just vanished from view. Autumn 1968. This story was related in a letter by the witness, John Scarra, a practical man. It is not certain whether it relates to the UFO phenomenon, but is by no means an unheard-of type of story, and occurred in an area where UFO events have been recorded in the past. It occurred at 12:30 a.m. on a fine night. Mr. Scarra was walking to work along St. Nicholas Avenue, Hull, when he saw a strange man. He was between 5'10" and 6 foot tall, dressed in coveralls, tightly fitted at the ankles. His hair was brushed back. As he confronted Mr. Scarra, he gave a look of surprise and stared at him for a few seconds. He then turned around and just vanished. Mr. Scarra was frightened, thinking he had hidden in the shadows to waylay him, but when nothing happened, he looked closely at the spot. There was no way in which the man could have escaped, but also there was not the slightest trace of him. The witness has never had psychic experiences and insists that this man was solid and reacted very strangely upon meeting him. This encounter involves a most unusual and frightening experience that befell Trevor, a teenage boy from Essex, whilst on holiday with his parents in the mid-Wales mountains on July 22, 1975. At 5 p.m., Trevor, being a loner, decided to climb up a nearby hill. At the brow, he saw a strange object on the ground before him and hid behind a rock to watch. He observed a rounded object, about 40 feet in diameter and 7 or 8 feet high, with a row of about 7 lights on the base that gave out light of a color he had never seen before. They cast no glow. Inset on the base was a rounded, transparent dome with a large light on the top inside, again of an unknown hue. In the center was a seemingly metallic control panel of complex shape. Inside the dome were 2 entities, looking like lumps of translucent white jelly made up of hundreds of tiny donuts. These were changing shape at the edges like an amoeba. Suddenly, a panel swiveled open on the base of the object, and one entity began to float towards it and begin to descend outwards. Trevor, not surprisingly, ran away. He ran to the base of the hill where his father attests he said, "You won't believe me, come on." He then ran back up the hill, but his father did not follow. He did see him lie on the grass for a few moments and then return, totally petrified, saying, "A jellyman got out of it." On his second trip back, the boy had seen both jellymen back inside, heard a noise like a car quietly revving up, and saw the lights begin to flash faster and faster in the colors of earth and sky before enveloping the whole craft, which then just blended in with the surroundings and vanished. Trevor finds it immensely difficult to describe this process. The horrific after effects soon set in. He became blind in one eye, changed from a quiet to an aggressive boy, and became so ill that he had to have extensive psychiatric treatment, which he still undergoes. Whatever the cause, there is no doubt about the effects. Apparently one night in April 1977, at about 9 p.m., teenager Jill Vouse was parked in a car with her boyfriend at an isolated spot off the main road near Worrell, South Yorks. Hearing a soft rustle, like footsteps, Jill turned to look through the back window. Her boyfriend looked too, and both saw an orange light close to the ground. Thinking at first it was a car headlight, they were shocked when it grew in size and appeared as a large hemisphere, all colored orange. It came towards the car and something made them turn on the radio. All they got was heavy static. As the UFO approached, still close to the ground, the silhouette of a tall, broad, human-like figure was seen in the middle. He was totally dark, but surrounded by a white haze. The witnesses now decided to leave and sped away. The object paced the car, keeping a level course even when they went into hollows. Turning towards the main road, they saw a UFO with 2 white lights in front, which they took to be a car between them and it. A few seconds later, they glanced back and everything had disappeared. July 1976, Oakenholt, Clued. The incident took place on Saturday, July 24th, during a hot, sunny day. At around 2 p.m., 9-year-old Gaynor Sunderland was riding her bike on a lane near her home when she saw over a hedge in a field a metallic object. Thinking at first it was something from a carnival, she got off and crouched in the hedge to watch. The object was a silvery dome with a rim around the bottom, about 10 feet high and 35 feet wide. It had a row of 4 square windows that were different shades of yellow blended in. She saw a dark shape pass across one window and stayed hidden, frightened she might be scared away. After a few minutes, a figure appeared from around the back. He was dressed in a one-piece silver suit with a balaclava-type helmet and thick-soled boots, like a diver's. He was about 5 feet 5 inches tall and had an angular body with the knee joint high up. He also had just 4 fingers, 3 pointed and a thumb, and a pale, thin face with large white eyes and tiny pink pupils. Gaynor obtained a close-up view as the man came within 10 feet, carrying an L-shaped cream gun that fired a red ray to the ground. He made a series of 5 to 6 little holes in the grass and bent stiffly to feel them. Presently, the man returned to the side of the craft, where a ramp came down, and he seemingly communicated with a hand that came out. He then went in, and moments later, a woman came out. She was similar to the man, but about 4 inches smaller, and carried a long, jagged dagger that she used to scrape the holes. Presently, she returned to the craft too, upon hearing a whimpering noise from it. Gaynor felt that both entities had detected her presence and had physiological sensations of dizziness and nausea when they looked at her. She was rooted to the spot. When the woman was back in, she fled, gashing up her leg badly on the hedge. She saw the UFO take off at an angle into the one cloud in the sky. It made a hum. She smelt a burning, and the leaves on adjacent trees trembled. It did not come out of the cloud. The next day she returned with her brother to the field and found a circular area of silver-tinted grass. The holes had been filled in, but the grass was noticeably greener around them. Gaynor was recently regressively hypnotized. She added a few more details, but there was no significant change in her testimony, which is far more complex than this summary presents. The hypnotist was positive she was relating an experience that had genuinely taken place. Readers will recall the story of Gaynor Sunderland, now 12, and her 1976 sighting of a landed UFO plus silver-suited entities in a field near her Oakenholt, Clued home. On June 26th at 9 a.m., Mrs. Sunderland called me to advise of a close encounter of the 4th kind Gaynor told her she had had that night. I spoke to Gaynor at first opportunity in the evening, and this is the story that emerged. It was a humid night, and Gaynor went to bed, as usual, at 8:30 p.m. She read a book about her favorite hobby, ice skating, then lay wide awake looking at the sky and wondering if horizon clouds would bring rain. At 10:15, Mrs. Sunderland looked in and told her the time. She confirms Gaynor was wide awake. Gaynor watched darkness settle until about 11 p.m., she thinks. She suddenly started feeling dizzy. She was looking at the ceiling, but now seemed to be traveling along a dark tunnel. Blackness was all around. The dizziness lasted about 10 seconds. She saw figures at the end of the tunnel, and then suddenly she was in lightness, standing in a field with grass, trees, and a stream. The two original entities were standing there wearing clothes. The man shorts and a green top with wings at the shoulder. The woman a pale pink dress with a hemline at the knee. In between them was a boy, dressed like the man and looking about 2 to 3 years old. She held a short conversation during which the woman told her she was called Arna and the man Pars. When she asked where she was told, "You have come far away." Gaynor now held the woman's hand and instantly was in a city which they flew over. She described this in graphic detail. The sun was very big and dark red. Then they returned to the field and had a further conversation with messages such as that they will come again and try to live in peace, promise of a gift that they would help Gaynor achieve, and the enigmatic comment that "we come to you in your darkness." Eventually, the tunnel returned, and she was back in bed, wide awake. She estimates the time was now about 11:45. She slept easily. It is interesting to note that at 11:20, amidst the experience, Mrs. Sunderland went into the bedroom and found Gaynor unusually deep asleep, as if in a trance. At 12:30, she went in again and found Gaynor sleeping normally. Early 1977, Houghton, Merseyside. Mrs. Street lives in a housing estate in the town. She is in her early 30s and has a son aged 12. It was 4:30 on a winter's night, and she asked her son to empty a waste bin into a large bin in the garden. As he lifted the lid, he saw a large head peering at him from the bushes at the end of the long garden. He dropped the lid and fled indoors. Mrs. Street believed he had been fooled by a light and went out herself, but she saw a pair of legs at the end of the garden. Looking up, she saw they were attached to a figure that was 9 feet tall. He was wearing a white suit and a helmet with a visor in it. Mrs. Street was still not unduly alarmed, thinking it was someone playing a prank. She shouted at it to get out, but it just looked down at her. She did now panic and fled back inside, locking the door. Through the kitchen window, she saw it floating just above the ground towards the house. She took her son into the lounge. It was by now 5:30 p.m., and a friend arrived at the house. After checking who it was through the window, Mrs. Street let her in. The visitor looked through the kitchen window and saw the figure and decided to confront it with a broom. She ran out brandishing it and shouting, but the figure just stared at her. In fear, she too then fled indoors. Shortly after, a male friend arrived to see Mr. Street, who was away. When told, he decided to confront the Joker with a knife. Seconds later, he came back in saying, "It isn't human." Then, yet another man arrived. He looked, but at first saw nothing. Then he saw the square head of the figure looking in through the kitchen window. He immediately took off to get the police. Meanwhile, Mrs. Street and the first man to arrive went upstairs and opened the window. They saw the figure looking at the ground. The man shouted, and it looked up and pointed something at them. In the dark, they could not see what. The next thing either can remember is walking downstairs feeling very calm. 2 police officers then arrived, and, with the others looking on from the kitchen window, went out to confront the figure. As they approached it, it simply vanished. The police said they could not possibly report such an incident, and everyone should forget it. Since the episode, Mrs. Street has seen many UFOs. She also claims many psychic experiences, such as premonitions and bedroom visitors. She was also visited by a man who said he was working with the aliens. He told her to keep quiet. After he had gone, she noticed all the clocks in the house had stopped. September 1971, 11:40 p.m., Alton, Staffordshire. A sighting of 2 entities with no UFO association, made more interesting by duration and multiple witnesses. Mrs. Wood is a housewife, and her 2 sons, now in their 20s, are a civil engineer and an electrical engineer with many qualifications. Mrs. Wood was retiring to bed and had not switched on the bedroom light. The village is tiny and dark, with no street lights. A few hundred feet away in a field, she instantly saw 2 human figures. Both were heavyset and wearing diving suits. Despite the darkness, they were luminous, one glowing more brightly than the other. The dimmer one was stationary throughout most of the sighting, but the other moved about in long strides, somewhat awkwardly, stopping on occasions to stoop down as if looking for something on the ground. He had to squat to do this. In height, the figures were over 6 feet. To prevent the belief that she was seeing things, she shook her head and closed her eyes. They were still there. After 5 minutes, she shouted her sons up. Ian came and instantly saw the same thing. He says they moved about like astronauts on the moon. He watched for a further 4 minutes until Wayne, the other son, came up. As he arrived, the figures started to disappear. The dimmer one just went out, but the other started fading in and out, dwindling to just a light. Within a minute, it too was gone. Ian visited the field the next day, but found no traces. Correlation with the UFO phenomenon is obviously dubious, although the description does have some similarities with UFO entities. It should also be noted that this small village was the scene of an unconnected close encounters case, which involved a disembodied voice and a solid tube of light standing in a garden. This occurred June 16, 1978. The event took place in late 1975 around midnight. The location was close to Donaghy, Northern Ireland. The witness, now 20, had been babysitting for neighbors down the lane. It was a cold, frosty night, and she had no coat, but when she was offered a lift home a few hundred yards down the road, she said no, though she feels that she normally would have said yes. She spotted the object on a bearing of 245 degrees, elevation 15 degrees. It was milky white and a clearly defined oval, twice the apparent size of the full moon along its major axis. She reached home and brought her father out. They stood looking at it for some 30 minutes. Then they went in with it still there. The event left a strong impression on the witness, although her father does not recall it at all. Their home is called Fairy Hill due to the proximity of a fairy knoll, and the surroundings are steeped in tradition of fairy mythology, witchcraft, and possible ley lines. July 10th, 1975. Ulo, Clued. The report comes from a Mr. and Mrs. Taylor who were returning to Manchester along the A55 near Queensferry at about 1 a.m. on the date in question. What they observed was not immediately connected with UFOs, as no object itself was seen, but when Mrs. Coombs reported her sighting of a silvery-suited entity looking into her living room in South Wales earlier this year, the Taylors heard the description and were amazed. It tallied exactly with their own sighting. The figure was seen for only a matter of seconds as they drove by a bend in the road. However, they were able to take in quite a bit of detail. The factor which made them feel that this was not a normal man was the size. He was at least 6 feet 6 inches tall, probably 7 foot or more. This they feel capable of estimating as they have a son who is 6 foot 3 inches tall. The clothing was bright silver and a cross between a diving suit and coveralls, surmounted with a hat which looked like a balaclava. The face seemed normal, though with a mask-like appearance, which stared at them in an alien fashion. When first seen, the figure was at the base of a tall embankment, about 12 feet high, with a hedgerow on top. It was facing away from the road with arms stretched up as if it had climbed down the banking. The area is an open country. It turned to face them and followed the car round, whilst stooping with the left hand to retrieve an unseen object from the ground. This story will seem fantastic to many, but it assuredly did happen. For obvious reasons, some personal details cannot be here revealed. The incident occurred following a UFO sighting by a man in the Midlands during August or September 1974. The sighting was not especially important, being just a light in the sky. However, the witness now found himself being visited by a black Jaguar car with strange men in it. It parked outside of his house for a time each night before driving off. Using a police contact, a patrol car was sent to keep watch on the car. Sure enough, it turned up, and for 2 nights the policeman timed its stay and departure. On the 3rd night, they were given instruction to apprehend the car and its occupants for questioning. The policemen left their car and walked around the corner in full view of the Jaguar. The date was October 21st, and the time was 9:05 p.m. They came close to it, ready to knock on the window, when in front of their very eyes, the Jaguar and its occupants simply melted away and vanished. Needless to say, it proved somewhat difficult to explain away what had taken place, both for the policemen concerned and for their superior. Clearly, this is a case you either take or leave, but it has to be explained as part of the UFO phenomenon. This concludes our broadcast for this evening. I hope you enjoyed the stories tonight, and thank you once again for tuning in. Wherever you're off to now, I hope you have a pleasant evening, and until next time.